talk about marriage and family, and just begin with some of the issues related to how we think of family. What does a family mean? And, what is the context in which we understand family, particularly in American societies? When you think about marriage, on one hand, marriage is, the center of family life, and it remains the preference. On the other hand, there is much more toleration for family life without the boundaries of marriage. So more and more, the ideal that you may never get married and is becoming more and more acceptable. People, we used to think about marriage as being just the only way people thought about families. That is very much so changing. And, that is a real issue when we think about, American society. Although most Americans want to marry, they feel less of a need to do so today. And in a lot of ways, marriage is competing with staying in school, with developing a career, even cohabitation or having children outside of marriage also becomes a reason to actually not marry, or a reason to decide to not marry. So when you think about all these issues of marriage and families, there is a change in terms of values. Our country doesn't necessarily look at marriage as being the pinnacle experience as in times past. There are many more values that people have and things that they like to do in their life that, marriage is not as important as it has been. And so that brings us to this whole ideal of what is a family. The social conservative definition of a family is only one definition. And, conservatives, when you think about even certain groups that are really to the right, the way in which they think about family is the conjugal family model, where there is only one correct family, which is the two-parent breadwinner homemaker model. And that tends to define the whole context of that family. That is the only correct family, and that is the only acceptable family. And however, there are specific economic definitions to what families mean, and those definitions are important because they actually give specific rules about who qualifies to be a family member, and in that respect, who qualifies for definitions. So when you talk about, how do we define family, what do families look like over time? We have to understand that a family is a social institution, and as a social institution, it is responsible for providing norms, values, beliefs, and social stability. And those are really important functions in our society, and it helps us to understand what families do and the function it has for our society. Again, a family can be a traditional family, a family can be a non-traditional family, but generally speaking, marriage has changed that meaning of what families actually mean. Monogamy is the most recognized form of marriage in the United States, and it's the only legal form that we have, which defines marriage as being a married or committed partnership with only one partner at a time. And typically, historically, in fact, it has referred to heterosexual relationships. However, same-sex couples, some of that is changing for same-sex couples. Historically, it's been an extremely controversial issue, but that's changing. And for those who live together, that is also a different type of marriage. And it is recognized in a court of law, depending on which state you're in, that cohabitation is also considered marriage. So when you think about, just the whole context of what marriage means, what families look like, we have to understand just the different type of marital bonds that people actually have. Now, when you talk about when you talk about sociologists and how sociologists really try to understand some of the phenomena, part of what we do is that we use what's called the scientific method, which is a way to it's an organized way to understand social phenomena in a scientific way. On one hand, when you think about the biological sciences, it's easy to understand how they get information because it's objective. In situations where you try to understand what it means for families and situations that are more subjective become harder to understand. How do you know this stuff? How do you understand these things? And part of how we're able to do that is because we use a process called the scientific method, which is a way to actually do research. And the research is done in a way that they're able to use hypotheses. They're able to look at a situation objectively, and all of these things are geared to provide, just the maximum way of doing research. And it's done usually, we do research with surveys, we do observational studies, and the surveys are usually national surveys. They're larger, they're longitudinal, which means the interviews are conducted at regular interviews over time, and they're conducted by social researchers. And research in this context is a way that we're able to understand and to make determinations about families, how people feel about families, what people's actions are inside of those families, and so that's just a snippet into what we do as sociologists. But again, when you talk about what families look like over time, you have to talk about just this whole idea of what is a family. Is a family a married couple with children? Is it a single parent family with children? Is it an unmarried couple with children? Is it a same-sex couple? All of these are really, really important issues to consider when you think about just the whole definition of what a family looks like, because they also define our social policies and the way we look at families in general. And so the whole meaning of family, if it's a non-traditional family, if it's a traditional family, and what that means as a whole, it gives us the perspective that marriage is changing over time.